The wind knifed across my cheeks as I stood on my parents' porch with 2 heavy gift bags at my feet. The wreath scratched the door each time it swung, and my sister's voice came from the doorway, cold and certain. Christmas isn't a place for losers behind her. The hall lights were warm, and the house smelled like cinnamon and pine sap. But no one moved aside to let me in. I could see my mother's eyes flicker toward the floor, and my father retreat toward the kitchen, as if the sound of a running faucet might drown out what was happening. My hands tightened on the handles of those bags until they cut into my palms. I swallowed whatever rose in my throat and told myself I'd find out why, before the night was over. Before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood on a doorstep wondering when family stopped feeling like home. My name is Mara Collins, and I grew up in a small Cape-style house where we were taught to bring a dish, write a thank you note, and never arrive empty-handed. Patricia and Gerald raised us on church potlucks hand-me-downs that we made presentable with a good wash and the kind of modest pride that comes from paying for what you can and sharing what you have. I was the quiet one who planned the details, packing lists for field trips, color-coded calendars, the first to volunteer for the cleanup crew, while my sister Laura filled every room she entered, laughing loud, borrowing freely, insisting that things would work out. When I finished school, I stayed close to Boston and took a job at a community health nonprofit, the kind that requires patient spreadsheets and a steady belief that small help adds up. My paychecks were never flashy, but they were honest, and I stretched them the way our mother taught us groceries first give, where you can keep a little for tomorrow. The older we got, the more our lives felt like 2 tracks running side by side but at different speeds. I lived in a 1-bedroom walk-up with a sagging couch and a second-hand table I sanded down myself. Laura married Evan and moved into a larger place with a lease that always seemed just a month from trouble. Where my world hinged on schedules and saving theirs was built on promises, and the next idea coming around the bend. Still, holidays threaded us together. I became the one who showed up early, set the table, and tucked small envelopes into stockings, bus passes, bookstore cards, notes telling Noah and Paige that I believed in them. It wasn't charity. It was family. And I never wanted the kids to feel the pinch of adult worry. Our mother told us that kindness was a muscle, and you keep it strong by using it, but she also said kindness shouldn't make a person small. I held both lessons close, though I didn't always know where the line fell. When the twins needed cleats the same week Laura's car made a strange knocking sound, I shifted my own goals to fit theirs. When Evan described a plan that needed a little bridge money to become real, I tightened my belt and hoped for the best. The house on the holidays glowed with the kind of warmth that makes you forget the wind outside, and if I heard the occasional sigh about how tired I must be, I let it pass. We were making do. We were together. This year, I was ready early. For the first time in a long time, I wrapped gifts without rushing, labeled them in my neat block letters, and slid them into 2 oversized bags that felt more like baskets of goodwill than obligations. I told myself this would be a simple Christmas, fewer grand gestures, more thought, something that matched my life instead of stretching it thin. I parked beneath the street lamp in front of my parents' house and breathed in the cold until my lungs stung in a clean way, not the ache that comes from holding your breath around certain people. The porch light flicked on, the wreath brushed the door, and I pictured Noah grinning at the puzzle tucked under the sweaters, Paige hugging the book with the blue ribbon, our mother pressing her hands together at the smell of nutmeg from the cookie tin. What I didn't picture was Laura's arm braced against the frame, her mouth tight in a line that wasn't quite a smile. I didn't picture my mother staring at the runner on the hall table, or my father reaching for the nearest noise to busy himself. I didn't picture the sentence that came out crisp as frost, sending my insides into a hush, even as the house glowed warmer behind her. I stood there with the bags, with my careful labels and quiet hope, and felt something tilt. The air was full of cinnamon, but it tasted like metal on my tongue. I would love to tell you I had the right words ready, the kind you deliver calmly, and then step past the threshold with your head high. But life doesn't always hand you lines that tidy. My fingers ached where the handles dug in, and all I could do was steady my breath and remind myself that I came here to be part of a family, not to buy a seat at the table. Somewhere down the hall, a timer chimed, and my mother moved toward it like she'd been waiting for an excuse to step away. My father turned the faucet on full, and the rush of water filled the space where a welcome might have been. I shifted my weight, adjusted my grip, and felt a resolve I hadn't planned take shape beneath the sting. I didn't argue on that doorstep, not then. I said little because anything more would have cracked in the air and fallen between us, and I couldn't bear to watch it shatter. I carried the bags back to the car, set them gently on the passenger seat, and sat with the engine off until the windshield fogged and cleared again. A person can hear a single sentence and still not understand the rule they've just broken, and that more than the cold stayed with me. I told myself I would get my answer calmly face to face with no raised voice to blur the truth, because if there was a mark I'd missed all these years, I wanted to see it in daylight. When I pulled away from the curb, the street lamp threw a long ribbon of light across the hood, and the house behind me was a square of brightness I didn't belong to. I drove the short blocks to my apartment and sat in the quiet kitchen with the bags at my feet, the labels blinking up in my tidy handwriting like proof that intentions count for something. By morning, the sting had cooled into a steady clarity I could carry, and I knew where I needed to go and what I needed to ask. I would return to that warm hallway and put the question plainly because the first answer had come in the dark, and I wanted to hear the next one with the lights on. The next morning, the sky over Boston hung low and gray, the kind of winter light that made the world look tired. I hadn't slept much. The sentence from the night before replayed in my head, louder than any alarm. By the time the clock hit 9, I was back behind the wheel driving toward my parents' house. The same streets, the same slow crawl past the corner bakery and the red mailbox by the park. The air inside the car felt heavy with what hadn't been said. I parked in the same spot and turned off the engine. The quiet pressed against me until I finally opened the door, stepped into the cold, and walked up the path I'd just left hours ago. When I pushed the door open, no one looked surprised. My parents sat on the sofa murmuring in low voices, and Laura was stretched out across the cushions, scrolling on her phone like she owned the place. I stood there, coat still buttoned, and asked the question I'd been carrying since last night. "What's going on, Laura? Why wasn't I welcome?" She didn't even glance up, just smirked and said, "You really don't get it, do you? You've been slacking off." My jaw tightened. "Slacking off?" She sighed like the word bored her. "The kids barely got anything from you this year." "It's embarrassing." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her. "Embarrassing," I repeated. "I spent weeks shopping Laura. The car's full of gifts for everyone." That made her finally look up her phone sliding onto her lap. "Last year you did more. This year it's like you don't care anymore." She said it slowly like she was explaining something obvious to a child. "People notice, Mara. It reflects on us." I looked to my parents, hoping for backup, but Mom only shifted uncomfortably, and Dad rubbed the back of his neck without meeting my eyes. The silence between us said everything. I wasn't just unwelcome. I was being measured, and apparently I had failed the test. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "I've done everything I could for you and your family." "I always have." Laura shrugged, stretching her arms behind her head. "Then maybe that's the problem. You used to do better." The words hit harder than I expected. I walked out before I could say something I'd regret. The cold outside was almost a relief compared to the suffocating air in that room. I sat in my car staring at the steering wheel, feeling a kind of ache that didn't have a name. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was exhaustion. Either way, it was enough. As I drove home, the rhythm of the tires on the road seemed to pull memories out of hiding. I remembered the first time Laura called crying years ago. Their landlord had taped an eviction notice to the door, and she said the kids didn't have anywhere to go. I wired the money that same afternoon. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the right thing to do. After that, it became a pattern. When their car broke down, I paid the mechanic directly. When the twins needed laptops for school, I ordered them that night. When Evan said he had a business plan that just needed a little seed money, I wrote the check trusting he meant it. Each time I told myself it was temporary. They just needed a hand until things steadied. But temporary turned into always, and the line between helping and being used blurred until it disappeared. Back then, the thank yous came quickly, text messages with too many exclamation marks, smiling family photos, the kind that make you forget the cost behind them. But over the years, the gratitude faded, replaced by quiet expectation. If I ever hesitated, Laura's tone shifted just enough to remind me of my supposed responsibility. "You're the stable one," she'd say. "You can handle it." I'd nod because being stable had become my identity. The helper. The one who didn't say no. One summer when money was tight for them again, Laura mentioned how sad it would be if Noah and Paige couldn't go to camp. She didn't ask directly. She didn't have to. The pause after her words did the asking for her. "I guess they'll just be home all summer bored," she'd said, eyes wide and heavy with suggestion. I remember sending the payment that same night. The next morning, she posted pictures of the kids waving from the camp bus, thanking family for making it possible. I pressed the like button and went back to work. Sitting at my kitchen table now with last night's snow melting on the window ledge, I realized how long I'd been pretending that what I was doing still meant something to her. The truth was simpler and sharper. I had stopped being a sister in her eyes and started being an account number. The more I gave, the less I seemed to count. That Christmas argument wasn't about gifts, it was about control. I had changed one habit, spent a little less, and that small shift cracked the system she'd built around me. I spent that night wide awake, the ceiling faintly glowing with the city light outside. I thought about every bill I'd covered, every emergency that turned out to be bad planning, every moment I'd chosen to keep peace instead of setting a boundary. And then I thought about the way Laura's mouth had twisted around the word loser. The memory stung, but underneath it was something steadier clarity. I wasn't angry about being called names. I was angry because I had earned them nothing but comfort, and still it wasn't enough. By morning, the decision had formed itself. No speech, no grand announcement, just quiet resolve. I wasn't sending another dollar. Not for bills, not for sports teams, not for unexpected costs. I didn't owe anyone proof of loyalty in the form of a receipt. If Laura wanted distance, she could have it. I'd see what her life looked like when I wasn't filling the gaps. Days slipped by. Christmas morning came and went without a message. New Year's Eve passed in silence, too. My phone stayed dark except for work reminders and spam calls. I cooked myself a small dinner, watched the fireworks flicker over the rooftops through the window, and waited for something that never came. No apology, no check-in, not even a simple Happy New Year. It was almost comical how empty the quiet felt at first. But then somewhere in that stillness, I noticed I could breathe again. I started my mornings with coffee and no guilt. I went to work without checking my bank balance 3 times. Evenings stretched open like something new. I cleaned, I read, I slept. The ache of being cut off dulled into habit, and habit turned into peace. But every now and then, especially when I passed a family in the park or saw a sister helping another with groceries, a small flicker of grief would rise, then fade before I could name it. By mid-January, the silence had taken on a different shape. It wasn't just quiet, it was deliberate. I realized Laura wasn't avoiding me out of anger, she was waiting for me to break first, to call to apologize, to resume my old role. I could almost picture her telling our parents that I'd come around soon, that I always did. But she didn't understand this new version of me, the one who had nothing left to give but patience. The first knock on my door came 2 weeks later. Sharp, hurried, impossible to ignore. I was halfway through making pasta when it started. The second round of pounding rattled the frame. When I opened the door, Laura stood there flushed and tense with Evan hovering behind her like a shadow. "We need to talk," she said, brushing past me before I could answer. Her coat still smelled like the cold. Evan's hands stayed jammed in his pockets, his eyes darting anywhere but mine. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You've made your point, Mara, but this has gone on long enough." She turned to face me, her voice edged with accusation. "The kids barely have what they need. Evan's doing everything he can." I folded my arms, steadying my breath. "Everything he can," I said, quietly. Last I heard, he was between jobs again, working on something big. Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't defend himself. Laura's eyes flashed. "This isn't about him. It's about you. You've always helped before, and now you've decided you're too good for your own family." My voice came out steady, lower than I expected. "No. I've decided I'm done being your bank, that's all." Her mouth thinned into a hard line. "You think you're punishing me, but you're really punishing the kids." The words landed exactly where she wanted them to, right in the chest. I paused, then said quietly, "The kids are your responsibility, Laura. And Evan's, not mine." The room went still. She looked to her husband for support, but he only shifted and muttered, "We're just asking for a little help until things get better." I shook my head. "You've said that so many times I could set it to music." Her cheeks flushed red. "You've changed," she said. "You used to care about this family." I took a step closer, meeting her eyes. "I still do, but caring doesn't mean carrying." The silence that followed felt long and final. Laura turned, pulling the door open with more force than needed. Evan followed without a word. When the latch clicked behind them, the apartment seemed to exhale. I stood there for a long time, the echo of their footsteps fading down the hall. Part of me knew this wasn't finished. Laura had always found ways to keep the conversation going, especially when money was involved. But something in her expression as she left, the flicker of uncertainty, maybe fear, told me a shift was coming. And I was finally ready for it. 2 days after Laura and Evan walked out of my apartment, the phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Is this Mara Collins?" he asked. I confirmed, and he introduced himself as Daniel Ross, an attorney in Boston. He said he represented a client who wished to discuss financial matters involving my family. I froze for a second, unsure whether to laugh or hang up. Financial matters, I asked what that meant, but he said he couldn't explain details over the phone. His tone was measured, deliberate. "It involves contributions you've made to your sister and her husband," he said. "My client believes you should be aware of how those funds were used." My stomach tightened. I almost told him to call Laura directly, but curiosity won out. He gave me an address and a time for the next morning. I agreed before I could talk myself out of it. The rest of the evening passed in a fog. I tried to cook red, distract myself, but my mind kept circling back to that phrase, how those funds were used. The next day, I took the T downtown and walked into a sleek office with glass walls and dark wood trim. Daniel Ross was about my age, maybe a few years older, with the calm presence of someone who'd seen plenty of tense conversations. He greeted me politely, gestured to a seat across from his desk, and slid a folder toward me. "My client is someone you know," he said evenly. "It's Laura." For a moment I didn't understand. "Laura hired you." He nodded. "She came to me with concerns about her husband's handling of money, specifically funds you've provided over the past several years." I opened the folder. Inside were pages of bank statements, printed screenshots of transactions, even a few photos of receipts. Daniel pointed to one page. "This account," he said, tapping the corner, "matches the dates of your transfers to their household, but the withdrawals don't line up with family expenses." I scanned the list. Online trading platforms, hotel charges, electronics stores, upscale restaurants. My chest tightened as I read further. "You're telling me Evan used the money I sent for rent for the kids on himself?" Daniel nodded once. "That's what the records suggest." Laura found a statement hidden in his desk last month and began looking deeper. I leaned back, trying to absorb the words. It was one thing to suspect mismanagement, another to see proof in black and white. All those nights I'd rushed to transfer money, all the times I'd said yes without hesitation, and Evan had been living better on my dime than I was on my own salary. I asked if Laura had told my parents. Daniel shook his head. She wanted to keep this confidential until she decided how to move forward. She felt it was only fair that you knew. For a long moment I just stared at the papers. Anger, disbelief, something close to relief, all tangled together. Relief because finally the puzzle made sense. I wasn't crazy for feeling drained, for sensing something off in the way they'd treated me. I'd been funding a secret, and secrets always demand more. "What's she planning to do?" I asked finally. Daniel hesitated before replying. "She's considering separation. Her focus right now is protecting the children and stabilizing her finances." His tone stayed professional, but there was a flicker of empathy in his eyes. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. Tell her I understand, I said quietly, and tell her she's stronger than she thinks. Outside, Boston's winter air cut through my coat sharp and clean. I walked several blocks without direction before realizing I was heading toward the harbor. The wind off the water stung my face, but it cleared the fog in my head. I wasn't the villain in Laura's story after all. I wasn't the selfish sister who'd turned away. I was the one who'd finally stopped feeding a lie. That night my phone lit up with Evan's name. Against my better judgment, I answered. His voice came through hot and fast. "You've been talking to Laura," he snapped. No greeting, no pause, feeding her lies about me. I almost laughed. "She found your secret account, Evan. You can't blame me for that," he scoffed. "She's exaggerating, making a big deal out of nothing." My grip on the phone tightened. "Nothing you hid money from your wife and used what I sent for your own entertainment. You think that's nothing?" There was silence for a moment. Then his voice dropped into a low sneer. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," I cut him off. "No, Evan, I understand perfectly. You just don't like that the free ride is over." I hung up before he could answer. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in years, the tremor wasn't from guilt. It was from release. 2 days later, Laura's name appeared on my screen. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, then answered. Her voice sounded tired, thinner than usual. "Did Evan call you?" she asked. "He did," I said. "He's angry." She sighed. I confronted him about the account. He admitted some of it, but he's still pretending it's no big deal. I leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise from my coffee. "It's thousands of dollars, Laura. Money you thought was paying for your kids' needs." "I know," she said softly. "I've been making excuses for him for years. I didn't want to see it. But after Christmas, after how he treated you—" Her voice trailed off, cracking slightly. "The kids deserve better than this." I didn't know what to say. For a long moment, we both stayed quiet. "What are you going to do?" I asked finally. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "Daniel's helping me understand my options. Separation may be more." I exhaled slowly. "Whatever you decide, I've got your back." "But I can't go back to how things were." "I'm not asking you to," Laura said. "I'm just asking you not to give up on me." The line went quiet for a beat. Then she added, "Please." We talked for a while after that. Nothing deep, just small things about the kids, the weather, the chaos of packing lunches. But underneath every word was the feeling of two people trying to build a bridge out of splintered pieces. When we hung up, I stood by the window and watched the city lights flicker against the snow. Something had shifted. Laura's voice no longer carried the sharp edge of pride or entitlement. There was fear in it, yes, but also resolve. The next week passed in an uneasy calm. No calls from Evan, no messages from my parents. I poured my energy into work, into keeping life simple and steady. Then one Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "We need to meet," it said. Just us. We met at a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. The windows fogged with steam, and the smell of roasted beans hung in the air. Laura looked different, tired but focused, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She sat down and wrapped both hands around her cup. "I told him I need space," she said. "He didn't take it well, but I can't keep pretending everything's normal." I studied her face and saw something I hadn't in years: conviction. "Do you have a plan?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "I'm looking for rentals. I'm not telling him until I'm ready to move. The less time he has to interfere, the better." Her voice shook, but she didn't waver. "I'm sorry for Christmas," she added. "For everything. You didn't deserve that." I held her gaze for a long time before answering. "You're doing the right thing," I said quietly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was truth. And for now, that was enough. When we left the cafe, the wind had picked up, carrying the faint smell of salt from the harbor. Laura pulled her coat tighter and gave me a small, uncertain smile. "I'll call you soon," she said. I nodded, watching her walk away through the crowd, her shoulders squared against the cold. Back home, I sat on the couch with the phone still in my hand, the coffee shop warmth fading into the quiet of my apartment. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace, not because everything was fixed, but because the truth had finally come to light. I didn't know what Laura's next move would be, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever storm came next, it would be hers to weather, and for once, not mine to carry. A week after that quiet coffee shop meeting, Laura's name lit up my phone again, this time with only 2 words. "We're leaving." I called immediately. She answered on the first ring, her voice hushed and urgent. "Evan's out of town," she said. "A business meeting, or at least that's what he's calling it. I'm hiring a moving van this afternoon." I could hear boxes scraping in the background, the low hum of voices, and the sound of tape being pulled from a roll. "Where are you going?" I asked. "A small rental 2 towns over," she said. "Just me and the kids for now. I don't want him to know where we are until I've sorted things out legally." The words tumbled out fast, but beneath them was resolve. She was finally taking control. "I hate to even say this," she added after a pause, her voice lowering, "but I'm short on the deposit and first month's rent. I wouldn't ask if—" "Say no more," I interrupted. "I'll cover it." The ease in my own answer surprised me. This wasn't the same kind of help as before. This time it had purpose. This was about freedom, not dependence. By evening, the transfer was done. Laura texted a photo. 2 days later, she and the kids sitting cross-legged on the floor of a small living room, pizza boxes, open a little Christmas tree in the corner, even though January was half over. The caption read, "We're okay." For the first time in months, her message didn't make me anxious. It made me exhale. Evan didn't take the news as calmly. He called me within hours of discovering the house empty. The tone in his voice was wild, a mix of disbelief and fury. "You did this!" he shouted. "You turned her against me." I let him talk, his words pouring out faster than sense could keep up. "You've ruined my life," he said finally, breath ragged through the phone. When he stopped to catch it, I said quietly, "Maybe if you'd spent less time gambling with her trust and my money, she wouldn't have had to leave." He started to curse, but I ended the call. My hands trembled when I set the phone down, not from fear, but from the sharp relief of a door finally closing. In the weeks that followed, Laura started piecing a new life together. She picked up a part-time job at a small bookstore near her rental. The kids were enrolled in their new school by February. Every few days, she'd send small updates, photos of the kids' art projects, a picture of her first paycheck, a snapshot of a second-hand table she'd refinished with paint. Her tone changed too. There were no complaints, no requests, just progress. One Friday evening, I drove over after work to see the new place. The street was quiet and tree-lined with narrow sidewalks and kids' bikes leaning against fences. Her rental sat near the end of the block, a small beige house with a sagging porch but a bright blue door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. The kids were sprawled on the living room rug, drawing with colored pencils. Laura met me in the doorway to the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked tired but lighter somehow. "It's not much," she said, "but it's ours." I smiled and handed her a bag of groceries. "Looks like home to me." We sat at the small table by the window while the kids argued over crayons in the other room. She told me she was saving for her own car next, that she'd already set up a new bank account in her name only. There was a small spark of pride when she said it. "It feels strange," she admitted. "Having control over my own money again." I forgot what that felt like. I watched her stir sugar into her coffee, her hands steadier than they'd been in years. "You look lighter," I said. She gave a small, real smile. "I feel lighter." We talked for hours about the kids, her job, the quiet in the house at night. She said she was sleeping better now that the sound of the wind through the trees was easier than the constant worry of walking on eggshells. When the conversation paused, she reached across the table and took my hand. "I know I said awful things at Christmas," she said softly. "I wish I could take them back." I met her eyes. "You can't," I said gently, "but you can make sure next Christmas looks different." She nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. By the time I left, the sky was dark and frost glimmered along the edges of her front steps. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw her standing in the doorway. One hand raised the porch light behind her like a halo. Back home, I set my purse on the counter and looked at the 2 unopened gift bags still sitting near the window. They'd been there since December, reminders of that night on my parents' porch. I pulled them closer and unpacked the contents one by one. A board game, 2 sweaters, a few books. Some were meant for Noah and Paige, others for my parents. I folded the kids' things neatly into a box, planning to mail them in the morning. The rest I kept, not out of anger, but because I needed the reminder. Generosity without boundaries isn't kindness, it's surrender. The next few weeks passed quietly. Evan called once more from an unknown number, but I didn't answer. Later, Laura told me he'd been spinning stories blaming everyone but himself. "He's telling people I ran off with some mystery man," she said with a tired laugh. I stopped trying to correct him. I told her not to waste energy defending herself. Truth has a way of outlasting noise. As winter turned to spring, I began to see the changes stick. Laura took on more hours at the bookstore, volunteered at the kids' school, and even joined a weekend reading group. The kids sounded happier in the background whenever she called Noah talking about soccer practice Paige about her art project. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable. And after years of chaos, that was everything. One Saturday, she came by my apartment for the first time since Christmas. She brought pastries from the bakery down the street and a small plant in a chipped terracotta pot. "For your kitchen," she said, "something alive." I laughed and cleared a space by the window. Over coffee, she told me she'd finally spoken with a family attorney about the next steps. Divorce papers were in motion. When she left that afternoon, the apartment felt brighter somehow, the air easier to breathe. I realized I hadn't felt that particular mix of dread and responsibility in months. What had once been a cycle, her need, my rescue, was gone. In its place stood two women, learning to stand on their own side by side, but separate. A week later, my phone buzzed with a message from her. It was a photo of Noah and Paige playing in the yard sunlight, catching the tops of their heads. "They're okay," the text read. "We all are." I set the phone down and looked around my living room. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt balanced. The weight I'd been carrying, guilt, duty, resentment, had finally lifted. Still, a small part of me wondered how long that peace would last. Evan was unpredictable, and people like him rarely disappeared quietly. As the evening settled in, I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the lights outside flicker to life, feeling both steady and alert. Something told me this wasn't the last ripple from the life Laura had left behind. But whatever came next, I knew the difference now between helping and saving, and I was finally strong enough to let that line hold. By early March, the quiet felt like it might hold. Laura had settled into her rental, working steady hours at the bookstore, the kids thriving in their new school. For the first time in a long while, things seemed still. Then one Thursday evening, my phone rang while I was making dinner. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, Laura's voice came through in a low, rushed whisper. "He's outside," she said. "Evan's here." I set the pan down and pressed the phone closer. "Where are you?" "In the bedroom with the kids," she said. "He's banging on the door. I told him to leave, but he won't." I could hear a dull thudding in the background, followed by his muffled voice calling her name. I told her to hang up and call the police immediately. She hesitated, whispering that she didn't want to scare the kids. "Do it," I said. "Now." It took everything in me not to grab my keys and drive the hour to her place, but by the time I was halfway to the door, my phone buzzed again. "They're here," she said, breathless. I could hear the officers in the background, calm but firm, ordering him to step away. Her voice steadied with every word. "They're telling him to leave." A few minutes later, she said softly, "He's gone." That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept my phone by the bed, waiting for another call that never came. The next morning, she sent a text, filed for a restraining order. "Daniel's helping. Kids are okay." I stared at it for a long time, letting the relief sink in. Over the next few days, she told me what had happened. Evan had been calling nonstop, leaving voicemails that swung between apologies and threats. When she stopped responding, he showed up. He'd demanded she come to her senses, that the kids belonged in their real home. She'd managed to keep him out, but only because she'd changed the locks the week before. The police report gave her leverage to file the protective order, and Daniel arranged to fast-track it through court. When she called to tell me, her voice was calm, almost disbelieving. "It feels strange," she said, "like the air's finally clear." Weeks passed, and slowly the rhythm of normal life began to return. Laura started attending a small support group for women going through separations hosted at the local community center. She'd bring Noah and Paige to my place some weekends, and we'd cook or watch movies. The kids began to laugh freely again, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen in years. One Sunday morning while I was flipping pancakes, Noah looked up from the table. "Mom says we're getting a dog when we move," he said proudly. Laura chuckled from the couch. "A small one," she added. "Something that won't eat the furniture." Those visits became our new normal. No awkward tension, no waiting for the next crisis. Just small, ordinary moments, measured quiet whole. But peace doesn't erase history. It only softens it. Late one afternoon, as we sat on her porch with cups of coffee, Laura stared at the bare trees along the street. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think helping was love. That as long as someone was trying, it was my job to fix it." She glanced at me. "You were right to stop. I didn't say anything, just let her words settle in the air between us." The kids were inside laughing at something on TV, a sound so normal it almost felt sacred. By April, the divorce paperwork was filed. Evan had agreed to a settlement under pressure from his attorney, who'd warned him the restraining order wouldn't play well in court. He'd moved in with a friend in another city, at least for now. The silence that followed his departure felt like spring itself, hesitant at first, then warm enough to trust. Laura started saving money from each paycheck, small deposits that made her beam when she showed me the account summary on her phone. "I'm not rich," she said, "but I'm standing on my own 2 feet." A few weeks later, she invited me over for dinner. The table was covered in mismatched plates, candles flickering in jam jars. The kids had made place cards out of construction paper. She cooked her famous chicken and wild rice, and for the first time, laughter filled every corner of that house. After dessert, Paige handed me a folded piece of paper covered in colored pencil drawings. A house, 2 stick figures, a cat. "That's you and Mom," she said shyly. "You're both smiling." I kept that drawing in my bag for weeks afterward. It was a Tuesday when I got the call from Laura's workplace. Her manager, a kind woman named Jill, said Laura hadn't shown up for her shift. Her phone went straight to voicemail. My chest tightened. I called again and again, no answer. Finally, around 7 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "I'm fine. Sorry, needed space. We'll explain later." She called the next day. Her voice was steady but distant. "Evan contacted me," she said quietly, "through one of his friends. Said he wants to apologize in person." My stomach dropped. "You can't," I said. "You have the order, let Daniel handle it." She promised she would. But I could tell from the tremor in her voice that part of her still hoped he'd changed. A few days later, she called again, this time from Daniel's office. "It's handled," she said. "He sent a letter instead. No more direct contact." I could hear the fatigue in her tone, the kind that comes after finally closing a door for good. "You did the right thing," I told her. After that, life settled once more. Laura picked up extra shifts at the bookstore, and the kids spent spring afternoons riding bikes around their quiet neighborhood. On my visits, the porch was full of plants. She'd started herbs, small flowers, little signs of new life. One evening in May, she called as the sun was setting. "Guess what she said? We got the dog." She turned the camera toward a small brown rescue mutt, wagging its tail beside the kids. "They named him Scout. He sleeps by the door," she said with a smile. "Makes us all feel safe." That night after we hung up, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker on, thinking about how much had changed in just a few months. Laura's laughter, the kids' ease, even my own quiet. All of it hard-won. Summer came early that year. The city air grew heavy and sweet with lilacs, and life slipped into a rhythm that didn't feel borrowed anymore. Every few days, Laura would text me a picture Scout chasing the kids through the yard, or her latest batch of muffins cooling on the counter. Each photo felt like proof of something mended. Still, there were nights when I caught myself waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next aftershock. Healing doesn't erase habit. It only gives you space to notice it. One evening, as I locked up the office after a late meeting, a shadow of that old unease passed through me. The kind that comes without reason, just instinct. When I got home, I double-checked the door, then laughed quietly at myself. Old habits, I thought. But the next morning, when I saw Laura's missed call time-stamped just after midnight, the unease returned. She'd left no voicemail, no text. I tried her twice before work, no answer. Then finally a message came through. All fine. Scout barked at something. Must have been a raccoon. Sorry for the late call. The message eased my worry, but left a trace of it behind a quiet reminder that peace, however real, can still tremble at the edges. As summer opened into June, we planned to meet halfway between our towns for a picnic by the lake. The kids wanted to swim Scout to chase sticks. Laura promised to bring her famous lemonade. It would be the first family gathering we'd had in years that didn't revolve around crisis or apology, just sunlight, laughter, and the sound of water against the shore. And though none of us said it out loud, we all knew it would mark the real beginning of whatever came next. The day of the picnic felt like a turning point before it even began. The sky was clear and soft, the kind that made everything feel lighter. I drove up early to the lake outside Concord where the kids wanted to swim. The parking lot was half full, a few families already spreading blankets across the grass. Laura's car pulled in just as I finished setting up our spot under the shade of a maple tree. She stepped out wearing a sun hat, her hair pulled back, a little color in her cheeks from the drive. Noah and Paige jumped out next, already tugging off their sandals to run toward the water. "You found the perfect spot," she said, balancing a picnic basket on one hip. "I told you, no crowds, no chaos," I said, helping her unload. For a while, everything was simple. The kids splashed in the shallows, Scout chased after a stick, and Laura unpacked her homemade lemonade, the one she'd promised. It was cold tart and just sweet enough. I remember thinking how quiet the world felt in that moment. No arguments, no tension, just the hum of summer and the sound of children laughing. We spent the afternoon like any other family sandwiches, card games, Scout rolling in the grass. At one point, Laura looked out across the lake, her hand shading her eyes. "Do you think it's strange?" she said softly. "How peaceful feels unfamiliar." I didn't answer right away, just passed her a napkin. "It'll start to feel normal," I said. "You'll see." By late afternoon, the sun began to dip, turning the water a shade of gold. We packed up slowly, the kind of unhurried end that comes when no one wants to leave too soon. I hugged the kids goodbye and promised to visit next weekend. Laura smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You will," she said, "and I'll have something to tell you then. A good something." I didn't know then how much that promise would stay with me. 3 nights later, I woke to my phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was nearly midnight. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, but when I saw Laura's name glowing on the screen, I sat up. The call cut off after 2 rings. I tried calling back. No answer. I texted, "Everything okay?" but nothing came. The quiet stretched long enough to feel wrong. The next morning, there was still no response. I tried again on my lunch break, then after work. By evening, I called Daniel Ross. He picked up on the second ring voice, calm as always. "I haven't heard from her either," he said. "She missed her check-in about the divorce paperwork." "That's unlike her." He promised to reach out to her workplace, and within the hour he called back. "She didn't show up today," he said quietly. "Her manager thought she might be visiting family." I felt the breath leave my chest. She would have told me, I said. She always tells me. That night I drove to her house. The porch light was off, but Scout barked when I pulled into the driveway. The kids' bikes were still leaning against the side of the house. I knocked and called her name, heart hammering until the door finally opened. It was Noah. His eyes were red from crying. "Mom's not home," he said. "She left after dinner last night and said she'd be right back." I looked past him into the living room lights, still on a half-empty cup on the table, the kids' backpacks by the couch. Paige sat curled up with Scout, her face pale. "Did she say where she was going?" I asked gently. Noah shook his head. "Just that she needed to get something from town." I stayed with them until morning, calling every contact I could think of, friends from her support group coworkers, even the landlord. No one had seen her. By sunrise, Daniel had already filed a missing person report. The next 48 hours blurred together, calls from the police, questions about her car, her route, anyone who might have wanted to reach her. When they found her, sedan abandoned on a quiet road near the lake, everything inside me went cold. Her phone was on the passenger seat, still charged with the flashlight app left open. The police combed the area, volunteers joined, news trucks showed up by the 3rd day. I stayed at the house with Noah and Paige, trying to keep life steady, while every hour brought less certainty. The kids clung to Scout, who refused to leave the door. On the 5th day, an officer came to speak with me. He said they'd found footprints near the lake, 2 sets, one heavier than the other. They were waiting on lab results. I didn't need them to tell me whose they were. A week later, they arrested Evan. It turned out he'd been spotted near the rental neighborhood the same night Laura disappeared. A store camera caught his car driving toward the lake road around 9:30 p.m. When officers searched his trunk, they found a tarp rope and mud-caked shoes that matched the prints. He didn't deny being there, he only said he wanted to talk to her. The trial that followed stretched for months, slow and punishing. Daniel stayed close through it all, helping me navigate each step, guiding Laura's statement through the evidence that would never get to be hers. The truth came out piece by piece. He'd convinced her to meet him near the lake, under the promise of signing the final papers peacefully. They argued. She tried to walk away. He grabbed her. Her body was found 2 weeks later, just beyond the North Trail, covered with branches. When I saw the news headline that morning, it didn't feel real. The words blurred. Even now I can remember the sound of the kettle whistling on the stove, steam curling upward, like nothing in the world had changed, though everything had. The months that followed were quiet and endless. Noah and Paige moved in with our parents while custody arrangements settled. I spent weekends at the house, keeping the routine steady. Scout slept by the kids' door every night. Evan pled guilty to second-degree murder to avoid a trial. He was sentenced to life without parole. The judge said his actions were cruel and deliberate. I didn't go to the sentencing. I couldn't. Instead, I went back to the lake. The same one where we'd had our picnic just weeks before. The same place she'd laughed and said peace felt unfamiliar. The wind was sharp that day, colder than it should have been for early autumn. The water moved quietly, rippling against the rocks. I brought a small wooden cross Noah had carved in art class, and we set it by the shore with her name etched across it. Paige placed a single white daisy beside it. Neither of them spoke, and neither did I. There was nothing left to say. Later, when the sun dipped below the trees, I turned back toward the parking lot. I could hear the kids behind me walking together, Scout padding softly between them. For the first time since that night, I realized I wasn't afraid of silence anymore. It didn't feel like the absence of her. It felt like the space she'd left behind, clear, steady, and still holding light. But even as peace began to take shape, I knew the story wasn't done. There were things Laura had written down, letters. Daniel mentioned ones she'd asked him to give me when the time came. And when he finally called to say they were ready for me to read, I understood her voice wasn't gone. It was waiting. The envelope came a week after the sentencing. Daniel called first to make sure I was ready. He said Laura had written several letters before her death, one for me, one for our parents, and one for the kids. She'd left instructions for him to deliver them only when everything was over. I met him at his office on a cold Tuesday morning, the kind where even the sky looks muted. He greeted me with quiet respect and slid a cream-colored envelope across the desk. My name was written on it in her neat handwriting, the same looping script she used on birthday cards. I traced the edge of it with my thumb before opening it. The first line stopped me cold. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. For a long time, I couldn't go on. My eyes blurred over the words, but eventually I found the strength to keep reading. She'd written about the months after the separation, the fear that lingered, the nights she double-checked locks, the way Evan's shadow felt like it followed her everywhere. I've tried to believe that distance and paperwork can undo what years of control built in my mind, she wrote. But sometimes peace feels like borrowed air. Then her tone shifted. She thanked me for stepping in when no one else did, for giving her space to grow, for believing she could stand on her own. You taught me that love doesn't mean rescue, she wrote. It means believing someone can rise even when they fall. She ended the letter with a request. Please tell Noah and Paige who I really was, she wrote. Not the woman who was scared, not the one who made mistakes. Tell them I tried every day to be brave. When I finished reading, the silence in Daniel's office felt heavy. He gave me a moment before sliding 2 smaller envelopes across the desk, one for each child. Their names were written in the same soft script, the loops of the letters just slightly uneven, like her hand had trembled. She wanted you to decide when they're ready, he said quietly. I nodded, unable to speak. Driving home, I stopped at the lake. The surface was still the same place where she'd laughed under the maple trees just weeks before her death. I parked and walked to the small wooden cross we'd placed by the water. A few petals from the daisy Paige had laid there had scattered in the wind, pale against the dark soil. I knelt and pressed the envelope to my chest. I got your letter, I whispered, and I'll make sure they know. The following weekend, I drove to my parents' house. They were sitting in the living room, the air thick with a silence that had settled since the funeral. Mom held a photo of Laura and the kids, worn from being carried everywhere. I told them about the letter, about how Laura wanted Noah and Paige to know her truth, not the tragedy, but the strength behind it. Mom wiped her eyes and Dad nodded, jaw tight. She was always stronger than she thought, he said. We decided to give the children their letters together. A few days later, I picked them up from school. They sat on the couch, Scout at their feet, watching me carefully. I held out the envelopes. These are from your mom, I said gently. Paige reached first. Her small fingers traced the edges like they were made of glass. Noah hesitated, then took his. Neither of them opened them right away. Can we read them later? He asked. I nodded. Whenever you're ready. They carried the letters to their room, closing the door softly behind them. I stood in the hallway listening to the faint rustle of paper. Then the sound of quiet sobbing Paige's voice, breaking Noah whispering something I couldn't make out. After a while, Scout scratched at the door and they opened it. Paige came out first, eyes swollen, but her voice steady. She said she's proud of us, she whispered. Noah followed, holding the letter folded carefully in his hands. She said to look for her in small things, he said, like sunlight on the water. That night, I tucked them into bed and left a lamp on in the hallway. When I checked on them later, both were asleep, the letters resting on their nightstand. Scout lay curled at their feet, head resting on Noah's blanket. The days that followed felt different. The grief was still there, but it moved more gently. The children began to talk about their mom openly again, stories about her baking mishaps, her off-key singing in the car, her laughter during storms. Every memory became a small act of keeping her alive. One afternoon, I found Noah in the backyard with a notebook. He was writing by hand, pressing each word carefully. When I asked what it was, he said, "Letters for Mom, so she won't be the only one who writes." Paige joined him with crayons, drawing the lake Scout and a bright sun above their little house. A week later, Daniel called again. He told me the foundation that Laura's support group belonged to had launched a new outreach fund in her name, the Laura Jensen Fund for Women in Transition, he said. It's meant to help women rebuilding their lives after leaving abusive relationships. He asked if I wanted to attend the small dedication ceremony. I said yes. It was held at the same community center where Laura had gone every Thursday night. The room was modest, folding chairs, a simple banner coffee brewing in the corner, but it was full of women who knew her story. Some hugged me, others just nodded quietly in recognition. When the director spoke, she said Laura's courage gave other women permission to hope. After the ceremony, I walked outside with Daniel. The evening air was cool, the first hints of autumn coloring the trees. She'd have liked this, I said. He nodded. She changed lives without realizing it. I drove back to the house with the windows down, letting the wind carry the smell of fallen leaves. When I arrived, the kids were on the porch, Scout asleep beside them. Noah handed me a small wooden box he'd made in shop class. For Mom's letters, he said. Inside, he'd placed her note along with the ones they'd written back. Paige had lined the box with pressed flowers daisies, like the one she'd left at the lake. That night, after they went to bed, I sat in the quiet living room, the box on my lap. I read Laura's letter again, under the soft glow of the lamp. The words felt different now, less like goodbye, more like guidance. She hadn't written it to end something. She'd written it to make sure we knew how to continue. The next morning, I took Noah and Paige back to the lake. The air was cool and still, the water reflecting the pale sky. We placed the box beneath the maple tree where we'd first sat together months ago. Noah stood beside me, hand in mine. "Do you think she knows?" he asked quietly. I squeezed his fingers. "I think she does." As we turned to leave, a breeze swept across the water, scattering ripples toward the shore. Paige looked back and smiled through her tears. "She's here," she said simply. Driving home, I realized Laura's voice hadn't faded. It had changed form, living now in her children's laughter, in the women she'd helped, in the quiet courage that filled the spaces she once occupied. And as we reached the edge of town, where the road opened toward the city skyline, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, peace that wasn't borrowed, but earned. Still, there was one thing left to do. Laura's name on a foundation wall was just the beginning. I knew there was a way to turn her story into something larger, something lasting. That would come next. The idea for the foundation began as a small spark the day after we laid the box beneath the maple tree. I couldn't stop thinking about Laura's words, how she'd wanted her story to help others find their strength before it was too late. That night, sitting in my living room surrounded by her photos and the kids' drawings, I realized I could give that wish a place to live. Over the next few weeks, I met with Daniel and a few women from Laura's support group. Together, we began shaping something that would carry her name forward, a program that offered housing grants, legal guidance, and emotional counseling for families starting over. We called it the Lighthouse Initiative, because Laura had always believed that even a small light could guide someone out of the dark. The first year was quiet but steady. Donations came in from neighbors, co-workers, even strangers who had read about her story in the local paper. Each message carried the same thread of understanding, people who had seen pieces of themselves in her struggle and found courage in her decision to begin again. When the first family moved into the small transitional apartment we funded, I stood in that doorway and felt something shift. The air felt heavy with purpose, not grief. Noah and Paige came to the opening ceremony that spring. They stood beside me as we unveiled a simple plaque with Laura's name etched across it. Paige traced the letters with her fingertip and whispered, "She'd like this." I nodded. Noah slipped his hand into mine and said, "It feels like she's still helping people." He was right. Life found a new rhythm after that. The kids grew taller, more confident, their laughter filling my house in a way that softened every corner. Scout followed them everywhere, loyal as ever. My parents visited often, each trip a little easier than the last. The grief never vanished, but it settled into something quieter, like a shadow that moved with us, not against us. There were still hard days, nights when I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to call Laura, ready to tell her some small thing, the kids' grades, the garden blooming too early, and then remember she wasn't there to answer. But even then, I'd feel her presence in small ways. In the way sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, in the sound of Paige humming one of her mother's songs, in Noah's calm, patient way of listening before he spoke. She was still woven into every ordinary day. A year later, Daniel invited me to speak at a conference for community advocates. I almost said no, but then I thought of Laura's letter, how she wanted people to know who she really was. Standing behind that podium, I told her story, as she'd lived it, not as a tragedy, but as proof of what courage looks like in the quiet moments before change. When the room stood in silence afterward, I knew we'd done what she asked. We'd kept her truth alive. That evening, after the crowd had gone and the lights dimmed, Daniel said, "You know she'd be proud of this." I smiled. "She already is." We both looked toward the banner at the back of the room, the one with the lighthouse emblem, its glow soft and steady against the wall. Now, years later, when I visit the lake, I still find peace there. The water glints in the sunlight, and the wind carries the scent of pine and earth. The wooden cross is weathered, the daisy long gone, but the place feels alive with memory. Sometimes I bring the kids. Other times, I sit alone and listen to the breeze ripple through the trees. It's never silent, it hums like the world breathing around something sacred. Laura once wrote that peace felt like borrowed air. I understand now what she meant. At first it felt fragile, like it could vanish at any moment. But over time I've learned that peace isn't borrowed, it's earned. It's the result of every small act of standing back up, every choice to keep moving when the past still echoes. If there's one thing her life taught me, it's that love doesn't mean carrying someone, it means believing they can stand. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise or punishment. Sometimes it's found in the quiet continuation of what someone started. And dignity isn't something given, it's something you reclaim when the world has tried to take it from you. When I look at Noah and Paige now, I see all of it reflected in them. They are living proof that hope can grow even from the hardest soil. And that's how I know Laura's story isn't over. It's just changed hands. Thank you for staying with me through it. If her story moved you, take a moment to hold someone a little closer, to listen a little longer, or to lend your strength where someone's still finding theirs. That's how her light keeps spreading quietly, steadily, one person at a time.